Good morning. My name is Judy Kolb, and I was born in Shanghai, China. I am going to tell you my story. I don't know if you heard my introduction, so I will start again. Good morning, everyone. My name is Judy Kolb, and I was born in Shanghai, China. I am going to tell you my story. It is really my grandparents' and my parents' story, and subsequently my story. In front of you is a picture of my father and mother, Carla and Leopold Fleischer, on their wedding day. Behind my mother is my great-grandfather, James Gersman. By my mother are my grandparents, Martha and Julius Frankenstein. And near my father are his parents, Ernst and Frieda Fleischer. So I will begin my story. My grandfather Julius was born in 1889 in Berlin, Germany. My grandmother Martha was born in 1895 in Potsdam, Germany. They moved to Swedenmünde, which is in the very northeastern part of Germany, bordering Poland on the Baltic Sea. They opened a fabric store, employed 2 seamstresses, and they lived above the store. My mother Carla was born in 1920, and my uncle Heinz, my mom's brother, was born 2 years later. My grandparents worked hard and had a comfortable life. Extended family lived in surrounding towns, and they were all loyal German citizens. When my mother was born, my grandmother continued to work. She would travel with the newborn to other towns buying fabrics. In those days, many people made their own clothing or had it made, so their business did well. My grandfather Julius fought in Germany for World War I. He was wounded by a bullet to his elbow, which prevented full extension of that arm, but this did not affect his ability to make a living. Since Swedenmünde was a resort town, many relatives came to visit, so there were many families, pictures taken by the beach. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. But in the next few years, life did not change dramatically for my family. In November of 1935, the Nuremberg laws were declared. The laws would exclude Jews from civil society. Jewish workers were dismissed. Jewish businesses were taken over by non-Jews or bought at bargain prices. Jewish doctors could not treat non-Jews. Jewish lawyers could not practice. Everyone had to carry an identification card. Every woman had to write Sarah as her middle name, and every man wrote Israel as his middle name. Jewish doctors were dismissed, and Jewish students were treated with disrespect. These laws were not implemented until after the Olympic Games, the summer of 1936. Hitler used the games as propaganda to promote the image of a new and united Germany. In 1938, or by 1938, all Jewish children were banned from attending schools. My mother had already completed her gymnasium. This is high school. My brother, who could not, or her brother, who could no longer go to school, enrolled in a bakery apprenticeship. Next picture, please. My father, Leopold, was born in 1910 in Hindenburg, Germany. His father was born in Gleiwitz, and his mother was born in New York. In front of you is a picture of my father and his sister, Margot. In 1937, my father moved to Swedenmünde to start his job as a cantor, which is a Cantor chants the Hebrew melodies during religious services at a synagogue. If you want to bring the picture back to myself, it'll be a while before we see another picture. Thank you. After arriving in Swedenmünde, my father rented a room in my grandparents' building. He fell in love with Carla, and they were married 2 years later. In early November of 1938, German newspapers reported that the secretary of the German embassy in Paris, Ernst von Rath, was assassinated by a young Polish Jew named Herschel Greenspan. The consequence of this event was the rampage of November 9th of 1938, which is known as Kristallnacht. Hitler's troops in Germany and Austria destroyed Jewish property, smashed shop windows, looted stores, beat and murdered Jews. Synagogues were set on fire. The next day, the SS started knocking on doors and arresting the men in the family. My grandfather Julius was arrested and taken to a labor camp. My father was not at home at the time, so he was very fortunate that he was not arrested. After the horrors of Kristallnacht, my grandmother knew they would have to leave Germany. Their business would fail and their lives were in danger. But where would they go? It was impossible to obtain visas or exit papers. Countries were not accepting Jewish immigrants. Word of mouth started to spread that it was possible to enter Shanghai without any documents. Most of the ships traveling there were luxury liners and very expensive. My grandmother sold as much as she could of their fabric business at deflated prices, but was able to raise enough money for 5 tickets. Now she would have to get my grandfather out of the labor camp. She went to Gestapo headquarters, showed them the tickets and the exit papers, which she did obtain from the local mayor's office, to prove that they were leaving the country, and asked to have my grandfather released, which they did. Next picture, please. My parents were married on May 30th of 1939 in my great-grandfather's home in Potsdam. The next month, in early June, they set sail on the Gneisenauer, a German luxury liner for Shanghai. They were not allowed to take any savings except 10 mark, which was about $40, rather $4 at the time. Anything of value was to be left behind. They were able to take some clothing and furniture. These items would all be inspected by the Gestapo before shipment to Shanghai. My uncle recently told me that my grandmother hid some jewelry in the packed steamer trunks, which were called lifts. So he was very nervous when the Gestapo arrived for the inspection, but all went well. My great-grandfather was not in the best of health and would not be able to make the journey. My father tried to persuade his parents to also come to Shanghai, but they were hoping to go elsewhere. Next picture of the map, please. The distance to Shanghai is 8,000 miles, which is 12,000 nautical miles. From the port of Bremerhaven in Germany, they travel past England, through the Straits of Gibraltar to Italy. From Italy, the ship sailed on the Mediterranean, through the Suez Canal, then around India, Manila in the Philippines, Hong Kong, and finally Shanghai. Next picture, please. They arrived in July of 1939 at the Yangtze River port. Individuals who were already living in Shanghai came to the port to help new arrivals find available housing. My family first lived in rooms on Ward Street at 343 Ward Street. They are now in a foreign country. They do not speak the language, but they would need to earn a living. They met Mr. Levin, who they knew from Potsdam, and they joined him in his transportation company. Eventually, they bought the company and it became Star Transportation. My father conducted services in various synagogues and taught students to read Hebrew. He did bar and bar mitzvah lessons and did a lot in the community with other cantors that were also there. They formed a committee and did a lot of things for people in the community. Less than a year after they arrived, I was born, and my family moved into 3 rooms on 83 Wayside Road. My parents had a small bedroom. There was also a small kitchen, and I slept in the 3rd bedroom with my grandparents, and this room also served as the office for the transportation company. The area where we lived was called Hongkew, the poorest section of Shanghai. With the invasion by the Japanese 2 years earlier, this area had been partially destroyed, and about 50,000 very poor Chinese and some Japanese were now living there. Hongkew, still controlled by the Japanese occupying forces, was 1 square mile, and now an additional 18 to 20,000 Germans and Austrians who escaped from Europe between 1938 and 1941 would also be living there. A percentage of those arriving could afford to live outside of the Hongkew area. Shanghai was extremely hot and humid in the summer and very cold and humid in the winter. Most living quarters did not have toilet facilities, so what was called a honeypot was used, which was placed outside each morning and picked up to be emptied. If there were toilet facilities, many families shared the same toilet. Could you put me on screen again? Thank you. People often were sick. They were not used to the climate, the crowded living corridors, the food, and the dirty water. Diarrhea was a common symptom. Rats, cockroaches, bed bugs, and lice were prevalent, and the streets did not drain well after the rains. It was not unusual to see a dead body on these streets on many mornings. Mostly these were the bodies of the very poor Chinese. I did not get the common childhood diseases that were seen in this country, such as measles, mumps, and chickenpox. I did have whooping cough, and to my surprise, intestinal worms. These worms were about 8 inches long, a very interesting feeling as they left my intestinal system, which I do vividly remember. My grandmother had dysentery, which is an infection of the lower intestinal tract, producing pain, fever, and diarrhea. My uncle tried very hard to obtain some medicines to make her more comfortable. There was a hospital and Jewish doctors, but very limited medical supplies. We had to be very careful about what we ate. All water had to be boiled, all fruits and vegetables had to be washed in boiling water. The immigrant population living in Hongkew did set up businesses. There were butcher shops, bakeries, grocers, and local newspapers were written and printed. It was very hard to get accurate information about what was happening in Europe. There were restaurants, cafes, nightclubs, and theater performances. No one knew how long they would be in Shanghai, so people did create a life for themselves, all within the Hongkew area. For those individuals who could not make a living and care for themselves, there were the Heims. These were large facilities with many beds and providing no privacy. There was a soup kitchen where they could get their meals. This was made possible by the generosity of Jewish individuals who had come to Shanghai in the early 1900s and various American Jewish organizations. You can show a picture of the Heim, please. My grandmother, Martha, was the most optimistic individual. She would not let an evil man like Hitler dictate her life. She would do everything that was possible to make life bearable under the circumstances. The one thing that was difficult for her was learning a foreign language. They hired strong Chinese men called coolies to work at the transportation company, and everything was moved by cart, which was pulled by 1 or 2 workers. My grandmother taught the coolies some German so they could communicate. On the days that they moved sacks of rice or small items, she would run alongside of the cart with a stick, which, since kids would love to slash the bags of rice open, and people would try to steal items off the cart. On December 7th of 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. This is 2.5 years after my family's arrival in Shanghai. Funds from American charitable organizations cease. Any communication with the US is banned. Inflation intensifies. The arm of Hitler reaches very far. In the spring of 1942, Colonel Joseph Messinger, chief of Gestapo in Warsaw, Poland, called the Butcher of Warsaw, was sent to Japan and then Shanghai with a plan to exterminate the Jews in Shanghai. The Japanese did not carry out the plan. But in 1943, the Japanese ordered all stateless refugees who arrived after 1937 to move into Hongkew, which then became a ghetto. So this crowded area became even more crowded. Life became very restricted with guards patrolling the area and the curfews were being set. Next picture, please. If one needed to leave the Hongkew area, you had to obtain a pass. One of the Japanese officials checking these passes was named Goya. He called himself King of the Jews. He was short and would often stand on a table. It was always unpredictable how you would be treated. At times he would scream at you or slap you across the face. It was never pleasant. You never knew if you were going to get a pass for that day. Everyone was terrified of Goya. Next picture, please. After the Japanese surrendered, a group of German boys gave Goya a fierce beating. Back to the full screen, please. On one occasion, my grandfather handed in the paperwork for one of their transports. He was told that the papers were filled out incorrectly, and he was put in jail. The jail bridge house was a notorious place. It was a very horrible place, unsanitary and infested with disease. My grandmother sent my uncle each day to bring my grandfather food and clean clothing. When the person who hired my grandfather admitted falsifying papers, my grandfather was released. He never spoke about Bridge House or his time in the labor camp in Germany. My grandmother kept up our spirits. She entertained new friends and made the best of a bad situation. My father was very worried about his parents. His sister was also still in Germany. It was apparent that they were going to have problems getting out of the country. He appealed to the immigration department in Shanghai. He wrote letters to distant relatives and organizations in the US to see if he could get assistance for his parents. Many letters arrived from my mother, but in 1942, 3 years after arriving in Shanghai, letters from my grandmother Frida stopped. My father's parents and sister were deported and sent to Auschwitz, where they were gassed to death by the Nazis. My grandmother Martha's sister Betty and her husband were also sent to the gas chamber. Next picture. Picture after that, please. In Shanghai, my friends were mostly German, so there was no need to learn Chinese. In the evenings, my father taught me Hebrew, and when I started school, I learned English. Financing for the school and teachers was done by the Baghdadi community, especially Sir Horace Kadoorie. In May of 1945, when I am 5 years old, Germany surrenders. American bombers are now flying over the Hongkew area. Next picture, please. The air raid sirens go off frequently. I spend a lot of time under a heavy desk. On July 17th, one of the bombs accidentally hits the Hongkew area. We are not hurt and there's no damage to our street, but 38 refugees are killed, about 300 Japanese and about 4,000 Chinese. The bombings continue. It was a frightening time. But 3 months after Germany surrenders, August 15th of 1945, Japan surrenders and World War II ends. Back to full screen, please. It is certainly a relief that the war has ended, but no one had any idea about the extent of the horrors which had occurred in their hometowns and what may have happened to their relatives. The refugees living in Shanghai never planned on staying there. Even the Baghdadi and the Russian Jews who came much earlier and made a very nice living decided to leave. My family wanted to live in the United States. There was a quota to get into the country, so they were given a number and the waiting started. The Communal Department of Central European Jews set up an office in Shanghai. They helped families with all the documentation that was needed. Another step was to find sponsorship, such as a relative or an organization who would offer financial support if you could not find a job in your new country. In 1948, 3 years after the end of the war, we received our visas and were sponsored by the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. We boarded a ship, a transport called the SS Marine Adair, and it took several weeks before we arrived in the city by the bay, San Francisco, California. When we arrived, I was quarantined, and since they thought I had tuberculosis, people wore masks and gowns as they came to examine me. My parents were not allowed to enter the room. I am 7 years old, and this is the first time in my life that I am truly frightened. My TB test was positive, but I did not have the disease. Shortly after arriving in San Francisco, next picture, please. My family bought a home. There were 8 family members, my parents, my grandparents, my uncle who married while he was in Shanghai, and my aunt's parents, the Kaufmans, 8 family members living at a house on 29th Avenue in San Francisco. It was quite crowded, but I loved it. It was wonderful. My father was hired by a temple. My mother, grandmother, and grandfather were hired by Levi Strauss. My uncle started working in a bakery. At Levi Strauss, my grandmother was very proud about how many jeans she could complete in a day. This was called piecework. She also decided she wanted to learn to drive on the hills in San Francisco. She is now 53 years old. It is not a pretty sight, but she does it. Next picture, please. In 1953, we become citizens of the United States of America. In 1955, my father is offered a position as cantor and teacher at a synagogue in Chicago. So with my parents, grandparents, and my 5-year-old brother, we moved to Hyde Park. It is another new beginning. My grandparents are now in their early 60s, and they again find jobs in downtown Chicago. It takes several buses for them to get there. Next picture, please. 3 years later, it is the beginning of my first year of nurses training. I am home for the weekend and my father is not feeling well. He's very anxious and pacing around the apartment. He is 48 years old and having chest discomfort. My grandmother makes some strong coffee and we call Dr. Joseph. My father is taken to Michael Reed Hospital where he has a massive coronary. He is in the hospital for 3 months. Years later, I realized how amazing it was that he survived. Back to full screen, please. My grandmother showed me what it means to persevere. She was always, always optimistic. She wasn't going to let the bad guys get her down. Everything in her life was a challenge, and she was willing to embrace whatever she did to make it necessary for the family to stay together. I can't imagine the anguish my father must have felt trying to get his parents and sister out of Germany. It's even harder to imagine the utter sadness. When he learned that they had been murdered in such a brutal way. I was much too young at the time to realize the enormity of these events, but anger did not define my father's life. He never lost his faith. He showed what love and commitment were all about by the way he cherished and adored my mother and cared for his family. My grandmother, my father were truly my role models. So this is the end of the story. I thank you for listening. If there are any questions, I will be glad to answer them.
We'll give everybody a second to
Okay.
submit their questions. Thank you so much
Okay.
for sharing that. It's a really powerful story. While we're waiting, one that I had emailed the other day was, what kind of message do you usually share when you're speaking to children at the museum? What do you kind of end your talk with?
The emphasis is on everybody's story is important. It doesn't matter who you are. Everybody's story is unique and important. And to always remember that. And to be a good person. In the end, to be a good person. To your friends are your friends. To always be friendly. To see, if you see something that you feel is not right, speak to somebody about it. But in the end, just the importance of that. My story is my story, but you young kids are now writing your own story. And that is very important in its own way and always will be.
Brilliant. Courtney has asked, how did you get involved with the museum?
A few years before the museum was about to open, which I had no idea. I knew there was a small museum on Main Street. Had no idea there were plans to build a larger museum. So of course, when you have a museum, you need artifacts. So I was in a book group with a friend who was working with another friend, Dovey, who's going around looking at artifacts that people may have that the museum might be interested in. So the two of them came to my house. I looked around my house. I had all the papers that my father had left. I had not seen those papers until my parents had died. My father died in 1994. My mother died 6 months later. So I did have all these documents. I looked at them very carefully. The ones that were in German, I had someone translate because I can read some German, but not fluently. I needed to make sure I knew these things were correct. I labeled everything to say what they were. I gave them an album of my family's pictures. The little red dress, if people have seen it in the museum, Dovey asked me, or I said, I actually have that dress. And she said, could we have it? So I thought, sure, it's been in my closet for many, many years. So they took the things to the museum. The museum wanted my items, and I had no idea what would be shown. That was not a top priority. I just felt all these documents would be in a very safe environment. I made copies of everything for each of my children. So that's the long story about how I got involved. And since I did give them all my documents, when the museum opened, I thought I should certainly volunteer there. So since the opening, I've been volunteering, usually at the information desk, often in the holographic theater, which is absolutely wonderful. And again, that's my story about getting involved. So 10 years later, we're here, we're still functioning. It's a wonderful place to visit. I hope all of you will do so.
Thank you so much. That looks like all the questions we have right now.
Okay.
I'll leave it to you to say goodbye to everybody.
Goodbye, everyone. Good to see you. Thank you for listening in.